Today I want to tell you about something that you should know but have almost certainly never been told. You need to know this to save your life. And it's quite simply this. There has never, ever in the whole history of the world been a disease which seriously reduced the numbers of humanity on this planet. There has never been a killer disease. Such things just do not happen. I won't go into the biology of this, but those who perhaps choose to go that way will be able to work out for themselves precisely why this is so. But what I want to do is to show you some examples of what you've been told is one of these mythological deadly diseases, but isn't. So the first one we know about, or believe we know about, is called the Black Death from about 1347 to 1351. In the Black Death, around 1/3 of the population of Europe died. What did they die from? Now, just to put this in modern context, Black Death is nowadays called Ebola, and the symptoms are absolutely identical, as is the cure. Now, it's called Black Death because what happens is that large areas of black appeared under the skin. And what had actually happened is that the blood vessels had burst and deoxygenated blood was gathering under the skin. And at some point the skin itself burst and you had these body fluids spraying out everywhere. Now you know this from Ebola. What you don't know is what actually happened. What you don't know is that these pictures of an Ebola virus that you've been shown are artists' impressions of what a putative virus might look like. Nothing more than that. So let's have a look at what actually did happen at the time in Europe and a few years ago in West Africa and Central Africa. Now, around the beginning of the 14th century, there was a sudden plunge in world temperature. The medieval warm period came to a fairly sudden end, and temperatures dropped very significantly over a few years. The result of this is that the food production dropped dramatically. This, combined with a government system which actively suppressed innovation, resulted in mass starvation. Now, what actually causes the symptoms of the Black Death? Well, the collagens, and these are the bits of protein which hold everything together. And just let me point out to you, the internal pressure of the human body is much, much higher than the external pressure in the air around you. So if the collagens didn't hold everything together, you'd just literally go boom and spray all over everywhere. And because the chronic malnutrition resulted in a chronic mineral deficiency, the collagens started disappearing. And when they disappear, the blood vessels burst and you get these black areas under the skin. And as it goes further, more tissues burst. And at some point, you reach the point where the physical body is no longer capable of sustaining itself. Basically, it becomes compost. But now let's look at what happened a few years ago in West Africa, and especially those people who went from the West to Africa to help cure the disease. Some of them contracted the disease, from which I presume they were seriously undernourished, which is a chronic condition with most Americans. Those who came back to America sick with Ebola, some were treated with high doses of minerals and they recovered. Some were treated with pharmaceuticals and they died. Quod erat demonstrantum. So the problem was not a mythological virus. And do bear in mind that even the theory of viruses, or the hypothesis, it's not even a theory, it's a hypothesis of virus, wasn't invented until the end of the 19th century. So what actually happened, you have mass starvation, chronic undernourishment, and this created the problem of the collagens disappearing and, well, you know the symptoms. Following the Black Death, the reduction in the population made it possible for those who survived to become much better nourished, and so the Black Death disappeared and has not come back. Because this was also the beginning of a change in society, a slow change, but it was the beginning of it. And improved agricultural techniques were allowed and later encouraged. And that's why we have a superabundance of foodstuffs nowadays. So that was the Black Death. The next one is the bubonic plague. Now this was endemic in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now the bubonic plague is, according to medicine, carried by a bacterium, not a virus, but a bacterium. The question is, why did it suddenly become endemic in the 16th century and disappear in the 17th? I mean, nobody had ever seen a bacteria. The microscopes capable of looking at it weren't developed until the following century. So, what was done about it? Well, nothing direct, because nobody had a clue what was going on at the time. But what actually happened in the 16th century was a move from the people living primarily on the land and towns being very small. And people started moving more and more from the land into the towns and cities. So much greater concentrations of people. On top of it, up until then, eating meat regularly was seen to be something exclusive to the aristocracy. So the peasants would eat meat if they were lucky on festival days, but other than that, their protein sources were lentils and beans and whatnot, which is actually much, much better for the human body, but that's another thing. With the increased general wealth at this time, people started eating meat only. Right? William Shakespeare said, only the very poorest people have to eat vegetables. Everybody else just ate meat and nothing else. And what this did, because meat is, for the human body, emergency nutrition, we can partially process it, but not very effectively. And getting rid of the residues is something which can be a very large, challenge for the human body. So eating just meat and nothing else engendered a different type of chronic undernutrition. A type of chronic undernutrition, which provided a host for what was called bubonic plague. But actually it was the meat that was poisoning people, and because they weren't eating the other things which would provide an antidote, they actually died from their diet. Now, if we look at, if we exhume mass graves, both from the time of the Black Death and also from the time of the bubonic plague, we see from the bones that the majority, or the overwhelming majority, of the people in those graves were chronically undernourished. So, knock this fantasy of viruses and bacteria out of your head. They are not the cause. They are at the very, very most a side effect. And the problem is the nutrition. Then we move to smallpox. Now, smallpox, there's a very large divergency of opinion when it first appeared. There's some that would say that the first recorded case was in 1155 BC. Difficult to tell because they're isolated examples and the symptoms described are not conclusive. They look like smallpox, but it could have been something else. The better date looks like the year 1588 AD. Makes a lot more sense, actually, when you work out what smallpox is. And you do this by looking at where and why it disappeared. And what caused it to disappear was sanitation. And almost the last cases of smallpox in Europe were around 1910, 1915, and that was it, finished, because in the middle of the 19th century we started building sanitation. Now, smallpox is a sort of emergency detoxification system. It's where you're living in an environment which is chronically, shall we say, dirty, chronically smells very, very bad, and chronically undernourished, and no clean water. Slums. And that's what most of European cities looked like in the middle of the 19th century. And this is why smallpox killed so many. In fact, it goes back earlier than that. It was a major problem in the 18th century. And then it goes on and got worse and worse until we started building sanitation systems, and when every town had its own sanitation system, smallpox disappeared long before the theory of, well, not before the theory of vaccination was introduced, but long before the theory of viruses came to be common parlance. So, the cause is extreme dirty environment combined with chronic poor nutrition. So, give the sanitation, clean the air, improve the food. These are all things that happened from the middle of the 19th century onwards, and we're still improving them today. But with smallpox, ceased to be a chronic problem around 1910 in Europe, a little bit later in other parts of the world. In fact, I believe there was a very, very latest example in Europe of a case of smallpox was in 1977. I don't know any details of this. It's just something that turned up when I was looking on the internet. How this woman had lived to generate smallpox, I don't know. But that was the last one. However, I would ask you to note here that in general, smallpox had disappeared in Europe and North America by about 1910. In 1954, the World Health Organization, which is basically a money laundering organization for the pharmaceutical industry, decided that they were going to eradicate smallpox by injecting it into people. Because that's what vaccines are. They're injecting a disease into you. And with a nonsensical theory that if we inject you with this disease, you will form antibodies right now, and when you come across the wild form of the virus, you won't get ill. There's lots of problems with this. Viruses, so far as we know, don't exist. Antibodies, there's no evidence for their existence. It's just being thought up as a marketing ploy. And just think about it. If I take sick material out of somebody who was ill, if I multiply that in, I don't know, what do they use to multiply it with? Spaniel puppies, aborted fetuses, rhesus monkeys, caterpillars, I've heard. Take this and then I inject that into you, this concoction, together with a lot of chemicals designed to suppress your natural immunity. What do you think is going to happen? Well, you're quite likely to get ill, and that's exactly what happened in 1918, the so-called Spanish flu. Now, there was no flu at all. The symptoms were, I'll just read out a list of the symptoms of people who were ill. And this is from doctors who were treating people at the time, and they described the symptoms of the people who died. Black Death, typhoid, diphtheria, bacterial pneumonia, smallpox, paralysis. Oh, there's so many different causes of that. That's not really something that you could just point to and say, well, that has a specific cause. It doesn't. These are just some of the things but nobody died of the flu. And where did all these diseases suddenly come from? Well, back in 1914, 15, 16, the pharmaceutical companies produces massive amounts of vaccines based upon God knows what theory, to protect the soldiers going to overseas, these dirty countries in Europe. And then the war ended much quicker than everybody thought it would, and the pharmaceutical companies had warehouses full of vaccines which they wanted to sell, so they persuaded governments to let them run a propaganda exercise. The soldiers are coming home from all these foreign countries and bringing all manner of diseases with them. You must be vaccinated against them to protect you. And so they started injecting diseases into people, and lots of people got ill with these diseases. Somewhere between 20 and 50 million people died. Not from Spanish flu, but from vaccination. And then there was polio. Now, the Romans knew of this. It was a very rare disease in their time, but it was there. And that's the way it continued until the first decade of the 20th century, when suddenly it exploded. Why? Well, polio is a big problem with the nervous system. And what had happened during the latter half of the 19th century were more and more refined foods, lots and lots more sugar being consumed, and so children had more and more caries, so bad teeth which had to be drilled out and filled up with amalgam, which contains a lot of mercury, that well-known nerve poison, mercury. That had been going on since about 1860. And then in the early part of the 20th century, domestic insecticides came into use in ever-growing quantities. Now, insecticides are for the most part also nerve poisons. They kill by blocking the insect's nervous system. And it's this combination which caused the explosion in polio. Now, polio wasn't conquered with vaccination. Polio ceased when DDT and a few other highly toxic pesticides were banned. And we see this nowadays throughout the world. The only places where you find polio are those few countries which still allow the use of DDT, and those countries where, thanks to the generosity of Mr. Gates, there's large-scale polio vaccination. Those countries, such as the Philippines, have massive numbers of polio, which didn't exist before the vaccination program started. So, now you see what reality is and why you need to know it. So, what should all this tell you? Well, it tells you that for at least 100 years, you've been lied to in order to sell you medicines that make you ill. And that's exactly what is happening right now. All that they've done is that they've given the common cold a new name and told you that it's a deadly disease. It isn't. Which is why nobody has died of it. And I mean that literally. Nobody. There's no clear evidence that anybody anywhere on the planet has died of so-called COVID-19 or the common cold or mild flu. We say that cold and the flu are not two separate things. The one can easily go over in the other because they're very, very similar detoxification processes. They're not illnesses. They're natural detoxification processes. And the death rate in all countries of the world where I've been able to access statistics, the death rate is running below normal, below the average for the last 5 years. That tells you that there is no deadly disease happening because nobody is dying, nobody is getting ill, hospitals everywhere empty or almost empty. I published a report a few days ago from Cornwall in southwest England. 3 hospitals with something around 900 beds and 3 patients. Okay, the local medical officer of health contradicted this and says, no, it's not 3, it's 7. Why are the personnel in the hospital not allowed to treat anybody other than COVID? A disease for which there is no evidence that it exists. So, I'll leave this with you, just bear in mind, as you look through history, you will see that there is no such thing as a deadly disease. It's never happened, and it never will. All that happens is, every now and then, humanity goes in for mass self-poisoning, such as with vaccines, especially in 1917, 1918. And if you self-poison, you must expect some unpleasant results. And that's exactly what you get. So how to protect yourself against COVID-19? Well, eat cleanly. Eat only naturally grown produce, no chemically grown stuff. Avoid poisons, like fatty meat. Though, as I said, meat itself is only an emergency source of nutrition for humans. And keep yourself clean internally and externally. The less toxins you have in your body, the better your body will function, and the better it functions, the less the likelihood of you experience any unpleasant consequences. So, thank you for listening, and hope to hear from you soon.